May we start?
I want to get your opinion on something.
To the bigger picture.
Now it's time.
From B Media Production, this is Podcasting Essentials.
Hi, and welcome to episode 20 of Season 3. I'm Nick Schulberger, Managing Director of B Media Production. This episode, we're going to focus on the marketing of a podcast with Pam Kramer, who has a wealth of knowledge on growing podcast audiences from her time as Chief Marketing Officer of US podcast network Cadence 13. And to help me do this is ex-Adwoman, marketer, and now our very own producer, Nicole Goodman.
Hi, Nick. Yes, so good to be here again. Pam's fantastic. I actually met her at Podcast Movement this year, and she was a panellist at a session all about branding, marketing, and how to sell a hit show. So a lot of that she'll be talking to us about today as well.
Fantastic. But before we get to Pam, what podcasting news has caught your eye this fortnight?
Well, something that's really close to my heart, Nick, was an article I saw by Dan Meisner from Pacific Content called Downloads Are Not the Whole Story. And I say this all the time for brands that are looking for hard data, metrics, because every dollar counts. I completely understand that. But the truth is downloads are not the whole story. Someone can download your episode, your podcast, and actually not listen to it at all. So brands need to think a little bit more deeply when trying to measure the success of their podcast.
Yeah, well, it's something we're asked a lot by our clients when it comes to launch time. What does success look like? How do we measure this?
Yeah, really good questions. Brands need to think about, are listeners spending time with the show? Are they actually listening? Who is the brand reaching with the show? What's the size of the reach? Do listeners actually like the show? Are the podcast marketing efforts actually working? And does the podcast change listeners' awareness and perception of the brand, which is critically important?
Yeah, I talk about this as the intangibles. I mean, anyone can go get the hard figure from your podcast host about how many times it's been downloaded. But there are other ways, these intangible ways of measuring the success of a podcast.
That's right. And if we think about engagement, so across social media, you'll see a lot of podcasts have their own pages. And if people are talking about the podcast, if people are rating and commenting, that's great for the brand because whether it's positive or negative or they're having conversations or arguments, it's engagement. You've got people talking, which is fantastic. So you want to see people really engaging on that level. And that also moves through to word of mouth, which, as we know, is the main driver of people finding out discoverability of podcasts.
And of course, you can reach out and do your own surveys as well.
100%.
But even before you do your own surveys, there are ways of getting a lot more deeper analytics now as well. I mean, Spotify, you can get, because it's linked to a Spotify account, in their podcasting portal, you can see the demographics of the listeners to your show.
Absolutely. It's very smart what Spotify have been doing. And yeah, as a result, they have a lot of user data that they can refer to. The other thing as well is brands really need to think about, as you said, the intangibles. So their awareness, the perception, their brand loyalty. A podcast can really make a difference to those scores. So if a brand perhaps has a dry connotation, like if you're an accounting firm or a law firm, or even if you're what's deemed a welcoming brand like an Adidas or a Coke, talking to your audience on a more intimate level can change entirely the way customers and audiences see you and perceive you when you get to them in that intimate, in-the-ear experience.
And we've talked about the human element that a podcast can bring to a brand as well.
Absolutely.
Just to finish on this, Dan talked about brand lift research. Yes. Can you explain that?
Yes, sure. So brand lift research really is kind of going into more of the qualitative data rather than the quantitative, so as you were saying before, the intangibles. So it is, again, about awareness, perception, loyalty. Where does the brand lie in the minds of the audience? So when people say, what is a brand is really what a customer perceives rather than what a brand tells you it is.
Anything else before we get on to Pam?
Yeah, there was an article by Stephen Goldstein in Blogstein titled Consumers Are Drowning in Content. And Nick, we've spoken about this before in podcasting. Have we reached peak podcasting? Resoundingly no.
I agree. No.
Yeah.
Yep.
And they're having the same conversations in TV streaming world.
Yeah, I know. Well, just recently Disney have launched theirs. There's already HBO Max. There's Apple TV Plus.
Yes. So they're having their own conversation. Have we reached peak TV? I think what we've discovered, Nick, is that there's just so much content across the mediums, across the platforms, that the audience is really inundated with choice and facing what is known as the paradox of choice.
So what's the solution?
The solution really comes down to the core of any content creator. You've just got to make great content and market it really, really well. And as Stephen says in the article perfectly, good content will be crushed by great content. And similarly, average marketing will be pounded by standout marketing.
Well, that's a great segue. Let's find out exactly what marketing does stand out.
Yes, and few know more about this than Pam Kramer. She's actually based in San Francisco and has just spent 4 years as the Chief Marketing Officer of Cadence 13, where she and the team launched over 40 new podcasts in 3 years and generated well over 1 billion downloads.
Wow.
Huge. She's also spent 20 years in Silicon Valley and is a consumer product and marketing veteran with a passion for consumer innovation and technology. She's also recently co-founded 1409 Studios, a startup that's looking at what the next wave of podcasting might look like.
Well, this is an absolute must-listen for marketers. Welcome, Pam, to Podcasting Essentials.
Thank you.
Now, you started your marketing career in finance and technology. How did you end up in podcasting?
So there's actually more of a connection than it might seem if you look at just those two categories, finance and podcasting. My whole career has been focused on, I would say, innovations in consumer technology. So I'm from the consumer tech world. I've been part of companies that are always on the cusp of innovations, going from, let's say, nowhere to mainstream. So my finance experience was actually 100% online. So I was part of E-Trade at 100 employees. But the idea in, let's say, 1995, the idea of trading stocks online or the idea of managing your money online was wacky.
Yeah.
And so everything I've done has been digitally based, innovation focused, consumer oriented. And so from online finance to online market research to social media to video apps and then to podcasting. And I got roped into podcasting because a friend of mine was involved with Cadence 13 that was called digital media at the time, digital misspelled. And there was a reason for that. And I said, digital media, it sounds like brought to you by the internet. Nobody's going to remember that name and nobody can find it because the name doesn't mean anything. And so I started just as an advisor, a contractor, a consultant, and just hung around. And then we launched a podcast, we launched another one, and I felt like it was so much fun. I wanted to do it full time. And then I've been doing it for 4 years and now doing new things in podcasting.
That's amazing. Pam, there are a lot of brands that believe a podcast isn't worth doing without a guaranteed ROI and significant download numbers. As a marketing expert, how do you think brands should think about success when it comes to podcasts?
The first thing I would say, and if this stat hasn't been covered already, I just want to mention it. So the current stats are, and this is almost an unbelievable stat, but I want to mention it, 61% of engaged podcast listeners have not just contemplated, but they have purchased a product that they learned about through a podcast. And I think that what brands need to recognize is that the current golden age of podcasting, where people are very connected, it's as if they are listening to a friend, whether that friend is hosting a talk show or hosting a serialized documentary or a true crime thriller. People who listen week after week or month after month are very engaged with the host and with the story. And so you're looking as a brand, there's no other medium right now that connects with an audience like podcasting. So find a creator who connects with your audience. Maybe it's an existing podcast, or maybe, again, if you're thinking about a branding podcast, maybe you add a segment onto a podcast that you love and connects with your audience, or maybe you connect with a creator that you found, but it's really leave content creation to a content creation expert and then add your brand to it. I feel really strongly about that.
Yeah, I agree. Speaking of shows that you guys have done at Cadence 13, you were responsible for some huge podcasts like To Live and Die in LA, for example. And I assume they had really large marketing budgets.
Not as big as you might think.
Ah, okay. Well, even better. Can you talk us through the marketing tactics you used and maybe a little bit more about how you made that budget stretch? And also how you make podcasts stand out from not just from other podcasts, but other content like music and the number of TV streaming services that we're inundated with at the moment.
At Cadence 13, we built a playbook. So the playbook had all the components, let's say, of a typical marketing plan, but with a very heavy podcast bent. And then we would tailor the playbook to each show. And something like To Live and Die in LA, really a lot of the marketing was led by Donald Albright and the team at Tenderfoot, and we collaborated with them very closely. But let me give you some of the elements. So first of all, the marketing is not an afterthought or an add-on. As you're developing, and again, assuming you're developing outstanding, engaging, amazing content, as you're developing the content, like right in the middle of it, you need to be developing the marketing plan at the same time, because those things go hand in hand. Everything from, I will say, something like To Live and Die in LA had 4 other titles before it became To Live and Die in LA. And some of those titles sounded very viable to a layperson, but as you start to think about the pluses and minuses of calling it one thing over another, visualizing a certain way, how it all comes together. So all of those things matter. So everything from what you call it, to how it looks, to securing the domain, getting all the social media handles, all those things are almost the mechanics of it. And then in getting visibility for your podcast, I will say podcasting today is a relationship business. It is about relationships. So I don't want that to sound intimidating to people who might not have those relationships. I just want to be realistic about how it really works. So the relationships are about, first of all, getting word out about the podcast on social media through influencers. And sure, you could buy some of them, but generally that's not done quite so much. Being able to seed early episodes, even before you launch, with people who, again, have a decent audience that matches your audience on any social media. Being able to have relationships with the podcasting and radio pubs so they can talk about it at launch. Same having potentially PR people who can start seeding it to whether it's, the New York Times or Vox Media or whatever the target publications are. If it's sports podcasts and the sports media, getting people at those publications to listen to it early, and then also getting people at Apple, Spotify, Castbox, Stitcher. And you can, as a unknown, absolutely get your podcast known by some of those folks, but you have to come prepared. You have to almost post to them, here's my marketing plan, here's why this is going to be important, here's a sample episode. You don't go to them on the day you're launching. You go to them ideally 6 to 8 weeks ahead of time with sample episodes, with the communication plan. Here's not why I created the podcast. Here's why people will want to listen. And then also find other podcasts who may have like audiences, because it's highly collaborative. Podcasters love to share and trade. And if they like your show, people will be willing, because I think it is a very, again, highly collaborative, highly supportive industry. If another podcaster who has a bigger audience that really matches yours, if they like your show, there's a good chance they might trade with you, give you a plug, and then once your audience gets a little bigger, you can give back.
A lot of that, as you said, is relationships, and I guess it takes people resources, not necessarily a lot of actual cash. At Cadence 13, did you have any bigger budgets where you did splash more cash on marketing activities?
I would say there were times when we actually purchased podcast advertising. It wasn't the norm.
Was it effective when you did?
Sure, sometimes, because I would say more often than not, because we understand the medium very much and we would understand the audiences, but absolutely. But much more often because we tended to work with creators who already have an audience, let's say in another medium. But I will say folks like the team at Tenderfoot, so you mentioned To Live and Die in LA, their biggest and really first success was Up and Vanished. Up and Vanished was 100% created grassroots. Mm-hmm. I mean, really just hard work of finding, first of all, creating great content and getting a bunch of episodes out there and just plugging away at getting visibility wherever they could.
I think you certainly got the sense, I listened to the first series of Up and Vanish, and you got that sense that it was being sort of done a little bit on the fly, and perhaps in podcasting there is some attraction to that, although I think it was only a couple of years ago, but as time's gone forward, I think perhaps listeners are expecting a bit more polish right from the first word now. Would you agree?
I think people are always open to a good story, to someone who's compelling. I think individual hosts, I think it's harder to break through these days, but I think if you have great content and great storytelling, people will find it if you work hard.
One last question on the marketing side. For the smaller budgets that brands have, the must-haves would be the website, the social media, as you said, but...
And it's also getting yourself on being able to collaborate with some other podcasts. Yeah. And maybe you can't start with, the biggest podcast in your space, but you can find some others. You can absolutely find, there's plenty of podcasts that are doing, in the hundreds and single-digit thousands of downloads, let's say, a month. We've done, for all our podcasts, we started doing surveys. And again, people tell us over and over again, the number one way they find a podcast is through another podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the beauty of that today is that you still don't have to buy all those ads. So yes, we've invested in some ads, but I'd say the majority are trades.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And really there's a lot that happens in that realm in podcasting today. And I think even for an unknown, if you have good content and if you work hard, you have to work hard. You have to marry. Podcasting is not a casual medium. You have to marry it and take it seriously like anything else. It's not an easy side business.
Well, moving along to advertising in podcasts, there's been a lot of discussion here, even on this podcast as well, about the difference between host-read versus brand-created ads and also programmatic advertising versus baked in. What are your thoughts, Pam?
Host reads make a huge difference, without a doubt. There's no comparison. And why do they have such a high engagement level? Because they are essentially an endorsement. And it's a little bit different, let's say, because people say, well, why didn't radio work the same way? Because for some reason, that sort of radio announcer tone is more distant. This is really like you're listening in on a conversation, or you're connecting, even on the documentary style or serialized or more journalistic podcasts. They're still, I think the most successful ones are still very conversational. So when they go in to talk about a product, you're still listening. And there's no change in tone or we've even tested adding music, etc. Doesn't help. Leave it as a conversation. I know what works, and the host read is everything.
Do you think that that's true even of hosts that perhaps aren't as known by the audience, or they're not as familiar with the hosts?
Well, if I listen to you, there's plenty of hosts that I listen to now. I should open my phone and look at the shows who I didn't know before I started listening to their podcasts. But once I've listened to them for 5 or 6 episodes, I know them pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Malcolm Gladwell said, the people who read my books and the people who listen to my podcasts speak to me differently when I meet them at an event, and the people who listen to my podcast feel like they know me.
So Pam, with such strong experience working with brands, what's your advice for those considering entering the podcast space?
Look for the best combination of content and audience you can find. If you can afford working with an agency that's an expert at placing podcast ads, that's great. If you want to just test it, go directly to the podcast that you love. You're really recruiting as a brand to the point we were just making about who should be reading the ad. First of all, listen to how, for a show that you really like, I can tell you in the early days, and it still happens, I feel like it happens more than a third of the time, a lot of the podcast ads, even if they're placed by an agency, the brand itself, either the CMO or the CEO or somebody at the brand said, I listened to this podcast and I want to advertise on it.
Yeah.
So really, you're recruiting an influencer to talk about your brand, and you're creating a partnership. I think this is one of the few things left, one of the few things that exists today in the world that is really like a partnership for your brand. And you're really co-creating, if you could look at it as co-creating almost a new piece of content.
even before the advertising stage or they start thinking about how to monetize it, if a brand's just, or a small to medium business is thinking, gee, what can we do? How can we promote ourselves? What kind of content can we now start producing? What should they be really thinking about if they start, going down the podcast track?
Well, I'd say, who's your audience and what are they consuming? So I'll give you an example of something. We launched at Cadence 13 a great show called Market Snacks with Jack Kramer and Nick Martell. Daily show, two young guys. One of them was still in business school. The other one, I think, had just graduated. They were doing a daily show. Again, morning daily podcasts of about 20 minutes long a couple of years ago before, again, the New York Times Daily and some of these others became really big. They didn't really exist. These guys were pioneers in the daily podcast space. And Robinhood essentially bought it. They bought Nick and Jack.
Amazing.
And they made it part of Robinhood. So that podcast was on its own, doing their own thing. And I will tell you, they more than tripled probably the audience because they have a big account base. So it's not just, I'm going to get new customers. It's actually solidifying and deepening, depending on your business. Small and medium-sized companies, you're probably looking for new customers, but I just want to say this is also a way I'm just using this example, it was an existing piece of content. They actually essentially brought it in-house, made it much bigger, and also made it more relevant to their customer base, and I think created a very virtuous cycle. So if you're a small, medium-sized company, what is your target audience listening to now and why? And how does it relate to your business? And how can you either maybe create a segment on that show? Because Robinhood was an advertiser on that show before they actually brought it in-house, so they understood how well it generated new customers for them.
Yeah, a good way to test the waters if you haven't had a go at podcasting.
Yeah.
Now, last question, Pam, to the now and the future. You've recently co-founded 1409 Studios. Can you tell us a bit about that and what else you've got on the go?
Well, I like to look at, again, what's kind of new and what's happening in technology, and I love the podcasting space. So we are a very small group of us looking at new angles in podcasting. So think about what you don't see much of yet. You don't see a lot of what you might call education. If I look at how many hours I'm listening to podcasts now just as a consumer, a few more of those hours could be spent, let's say, learning a new language or learning something new. I don't listen to a lot of fiction or serialized fiction, or there are new ways that technology, I think, could be applied. Think about all these smart speakers and what we expect to happen in the smart speaker world. We're going to have a lot more of them in our homes in a lot more places. And how did those things get smarter about what we might want to listen to at any particular time?
It's very intriguing.
So, a lot of different, that's a lot of stuff, but we're looking at a bunch of different things.
It's exciting, yes. Thank you so much for joining us, Pam. It's been fabulous.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you both.
Wow, so much great information there on marketing a podcast. And what I found, I think, most interesting, Nicole, was that Pam said podcast marketing is a relationship game.
Yeah.
And it doesn't need a huge budget to be successful, just dedication and planning.
Exactly. It's that planning is the key. Again, it comes back to not tacking marketing on at the end of a strategy, but rather really bringing it up the front and having it follow you through your content development process. She was bang on about that.
Yeah, it's been a theme of ours in recent episodes too.
Absolutely.
So it's all coming together.
It is.
Thank you for joining me today, Nicole.
Thanks, Nick. My pleasure.
Well, that's all we have time for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. There's no denying how important marketing is in the podcast mix. So if you're still unsure of how to approach it, or want to know more about how we can help create and promote a podcast for your business, you can go to be.com.au. From all of us at Be Media Production, thanks so much for listening.